She had worn the grey 10 years, and on the 10th anniversary of putting it on, she stood before the cracked glass in her room above the mending shop and told herself, as she told herself every year on this date, that she was past wanting anything the colour could not give her. The dress was good wool, plainly cut, the kind of grey that asked nothing of a room and got nothing back. Outside the window, the doves that nested in the old dovecote across the lane were already stirring. A soft clatter of wings against slate, and the smell of the morning came up through the glass, the way it always did in late summer. Hay and hot stone, and underneath it, the metal tang of a kettle just gone off the boil. She lifted the thimble from its dish on the sill, pewter, worn thin at the crown, her mother's initials scratched inside the band by her father's own penknife, and she slid it onto the ribbon at her wrist, where it had lived every day since the night he pressed it into her hand, and told her that small things keep their shape longest. She turned it once, twice, a quarter turn against her pulse, an old habit she did not know she had until Hannah Slate pointed it out to her years ago, and she had never been able to stop since. 10 years. Her father dismissed inside a week, dead inside a month, and her mother 2 winters after him, and Eleanor Wren left in a cottage with a trade in her hands, and a name nobody in Fembridge would say, without lowering their voice first. She had been 19. She was 29 now, and she had made her peace with the shape of the rest of it, or told herself she had, the way a person tells themselves a great many things in an empty room before breakfast. Downstairs the shop bell went, brisk, businesslike, and she heard Hannah's voice pitched low and amused at somebody on the step, and she went down because there was always somebody on the step. A hem to let out, a seam gone at the shoulder, a mourning band to be sewn for some other grief that was not hers. Hannah Slate was 60 if she was a day, built low and square like a good chest of drawers, and she looked up when Eleanor came down the stair and said nothing about the grey, because Hannah never did, not any more, though the first year she had said plenty. "Grey suits you," she'd said once, long ago, meaning it as comfort. It suits a woman who has stopped asking anything of the world. She had not meant it unkindly. Eleanor had taken it as gospel anyway. This morning Hannah only handed her a folded shirt with a torn cuff, and said the vicar's boy had brought it round before service, and that the whole village was talking, had she not heard, and Eleanor said heard what? Needle already threading itself between her fingers out of long habit, and Hannah told her. The old Duke's son was come home. Not a visit, not a fortnight's shooting, and gone again the way he'd done twice in 10 years, but home to stay, home to take the dukedom up properly at last, now that his father was 2 years in the ground and the estate, by every account that reached as far as the mending shop, in worse trouble than anyone at the hall liked to say aloud. He means to go through the books himself, Hannah said, snapping a thread with her teeth, which is more than his father ever did in 30 years, God rest him, and God forgive him too, while we're being honest about it before noon. Eleanor's hands did not stop moving over the cuff. She had learned long ago that hands which kept working were hands nobody watched too closely, and there was a particular skill in that, in letting a needle carry a face through anything at all. "Which books?" she said, and heard her own voice come out perfectly level, and Hannah looked at her over her spectacles, the way she did when she meant to say more than she was going to. "The estate books, Nell," she said. "The rent rolls. What else would a duke want with a ledger?" Eleanor bit the thread and did not answer, and outside across the lane a single white dove broke from the grey wheeling flock above the dovecote roof and circled twice before it came back down to the ledge, the way it always did, first out and first home, and she watched it settle, without knowing yet that anything in her life had just begun to move. The summons came 3 days later, carried up the lane by a boy from the hall kitchens, who stood on the step turning his cap in both hands, as though the request itself embarrassed him. The housekeeper wanted Miss Wren for the flags and the old banqueting cloths, torn in a dozen places, and wanted whole again before the harvest assembly, and would she come up to the hall to take her measure of the work, rather than have it carted down in a cart, on account of there being a great deal of it, and some of it old enough to want careful handling. Eleanor had not set foot inside Rowan Chase since she was 19 years old, and had left it for the last time with her father's dismissal in her ears, and her mother's arm through hers. And she stood in the shop doorway a long moment before she answered that she would come. Hannah watched her go with a face that said several things, and voiced none of them. The drive up to the house ran between limes gone dusty gold, with the summer's long dry spell, the whole country parched under a heat that had sat on Fenbridge for 6 weeks without breaking. The grass gone the colour of old rope, and the house itself rose at the end of the avenue exactly as she remembered it, honey stone gone dark at the sills, tall windows throwing back the white sky. She had forgotten the smell of the place. Beeswax and wood smoke, and, under the great hall's flagstones, something cooler and older, stone that had never quite warmed in 400 summers. A footman she did not know took her through to the linen room, where an old woman with the whitest cap in the county stood over a great chest of folded damask, with the particular grim satisfaction of somebody about to hand off a hated task. And it was there, on her knees counting torn hems, that the door opened behind her without a knock, and a man's voice said, to somebody else entirely, that he wanted the West flags down before the assembly, and did not care what it cost to have them mended properly. She rose because it was rude to remain kneeling, and turned, and the Duke of Rowan stood in the doorway with the light behind him, so that for a moment she saw only the shape of him, tall, dark-coated, one hand still on the door. Then he stepped in, and the light came round onto his face, and she knew him at once, though it had been 10 years, and he had been a long-limbed boy of 19 the last time she had seen him, home from his studies for a summer that ended the same month her father was put out of his post. He did not know her. She watched it happen, watched him look at her the way a man looks at a servant he has never had cause to look at twice, polite, already thinking of the next thing. And something in her was glad of it, and something else in her, some old unhealed thing, went very quiet and very still. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not know the room was occupied." And she said it was no matter, Your Grace, and dropped the small curtsy the moment demanded, and he was 3 steps further into the room, already turning to the housekeeper about the flags, when he stopped. He looked back at her the way a man looks back at a word he has half heard in another language, certain there was meaning in it and unable yet to place it. "Have we met?" he said. And it was not a question aimed at courtesy. "Eleanor Wren," she said, because there was no version of the truth that did not require her to say it eventually, and better now plainly than found out sideways later. Thomas Wren's daughter. The name went into the room like a dropped plate. The old housekeeper's hands stilled over the damask. The Duke did not move for a moment that ran on rather longer than a moment ought to, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, gone lower, careful, a man picking his way across ice he was no longer sure would hold. "I remember you," he said. "You used to sit on the dovecote wall with a book you weren't meant to have taken from the library. I remember your father." He said it plainly, without the flattening courtesy people usually put over that name in this house, and something in Eleanor's chest that had been braced for 10 years against exactly this conversation found it had braced for the wrong thing entirely. Because there was no cruelty in his voice at all, only a kind of held-back trouble, as though he had questions he did not think it was his place to ask a woman he had met again 5 minutes ago over a chest of torn linen. She said only that the flags would want 3 weeks if they were to be done properly, and he said take what you need, and that was the whole of it. And yet she went back down the avenue, with her heart going harder than the walk warranted, and the thimble turned 3 full times around her wrist before she reached the gate. The engagement was spoken of at church the very next Sunday, not announced from the pulpit, nothing so official as that yet, but carried on every tongue in the churchyard after the service the way news travels in a small parish, mouth to mouth, each version a little more certain than the last. Miss Honoria Cresswell, £20 a year of her own bringing, 30,000 more behind her father's signature, and a face and manner nobody in the county could find fault with, was to have the Duke of Rowan by Michaelmas, and the estate, which had been quietly bleeding money since long before the old Duke died, and had been bleeding faster since, would be whole again, or whole enough. Eleanor heard it standing at the back with Hannah, in the grey that made her invisible in a crowd the way it had made her invisible for a decade, and watched Miss Cresswell come out on the Duke's arm, fair and graceful and entirely, maddeningly, without malice in her face. A young woman who had done nothing wrong except be born to money the house needed. The Dowager Duchess came out behind them, straight-backed under a black bombazine that had not softened an inch since her husband's death 2 years past, and her eye found Eleanor across the churchyard the way a hawk's eye finds the one thing in a field that has moved. She did not speak to her. She did not need to. She turned her head a fraction, said something to the lady beside her behind a gloved hand, and 3 women near the lich gate looked round at Eleanor at once, and looked away again just as fast, and Eleanor felt the old shame come up through her like water finding its level. The shame that had never entirely a place to go in 10 years, because there had never been a wrong of her own to attach it to, only her father's, inherited whole and unexamined the way a debt is inherited. Hannah's hand found her elbow. "Chin up, girl," she murmured. "That woman has been looking down her nose at somebody or other since before you were born. It isn't personal," and Eleanor said, low enough that only Hannah caught it. "It has been personal to me every day for 10 years, Hannah, whether it was meant to be or not." They walked home along the lane in the heat, with the wheat standing burnt gold and thin in the fields either side. A poor harvest coming by the look of it. Everyone said so. The drought had seen to that. And Hannah asked her outright. In the plain way she asked everything, whether seeing the house again had stirred up more than the linen wanted stirring. Eleanor did not answer directly. She said only that the Duke had remembered her father, and remembered him kindly, which was more than she had expected from anyone still living in that house, and Hannah gave her a long look, and said that kindness from a Duke who is about to marry £30,000 costs him nothing, and ought to be weighed accordingly, and Eleanor said she knew that. She was not a fool. And Hannah said nobody had called her one, and they walked the rest of the way without speaking, which between the 2 of them was its own kind of conversation. She went back to the hall 3 more times that week to take her measurements right, and on the 4th visit found the Duke himself in the long gallery, where the old flags were laid out on trestles for her to see the full extent of the damage, moth and damp, and one great scorch mark from some fire 50 years dead. He had been going through a stack of papers at the gallery's far table, and did not hear her come in, and she stood a moment in the doorway before he looked up, and something in his face when he saw her was not quite the careful courtesy of the linen room. "Miss Wren," he said, and came round the table, and then, before she could speak, he said her father's name outright, unprompted, the way a man says a thing he has been turning over and finally decides to set down. "I have been reading the old accounts," he said. "Your father's hand is in half of them still, 10 years gone, and more careful than anything written since. I do not understand how a man who kept books like that came to be dismissed inside a week for keeping them badly." Eleanor's needle hand, which had no work in it just then, closed instead around the fold of a flag she was not yet ready to touch. "He was not dismissed for keeping them badly, Your Grace," she said. "He was dismissed because your father's agent said he had." There was a silence then that she let sit, because she had learned long ago that silence did more work than protest ever had. The Duke did not fill it with comfort. He studied her a moment, and there was something in his face she had no name for yet, a door she thought bricked up rattling very slightly in its frame. "I was 19, he said. "I was at Oxford. I came home that Christmas and asked why Wren was gone, and was told he had falsified the rolls and taken money that was not his. And I believed it, because I had no reason then to think a house steward would lie to a boy about a matter of business." He paused. "I have had 10 years since to gather a great many reasons," he said, and did not elaborate further, and it was then that a voice came pleasant and unhurried from the gallery door, asking whether His Grace wanted the estimates for the west wing roof before or after his ride. And Eleanor turned to see a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed, comfortable in his own skin, the way only a man secure in his position ever is, smiling at them both with a smile that arrived half a second before it reached his eyes. "Miss Vane," the Duke said, "my land agent, and to Eleanor, this is Thomas Wren's daughter, come to see to the flags." Something crossed Vane's face too quick to call an expression, there and gone, and his voice when it came was warm as new bread. "Wren's daughter," he said. Well, a fine man your father in his day. A sad business, all that, very sad, and Eleanor said nothing at all, only watched his hand come to rest on the papers at the table's edge, and tap them, twice, with 2 fingers, before he named a figure for the roof that the Duke frowned at and questioned and, in the end, without quite knowing why, accepted. She left that day, having agreed, at the housekeeper's asking and her own need of the money more than she liked to admit, to come 3 days a week until the assembly to see to all the old linen the house owned. A bargain that put her inside those walls further and more often than any sense she had left would have chosen for her, had sense been the thing deciding. It was in the 3rd week of that bargain, with the assembly 10 days off and the flags nearly whole again, that she found the torn page. She had been going through an old chest of household papers the housekeeper wanted sorted from rubbish, mostly nothing, mostly grocers' bills 40 years stale, when her hand came on a single sheet of rent roll, water-marked. The corner burned as though it had been pulled half out of a fire, and the hand that had written the figures on it was her father's, small and upright and exact, and the figures did not match, not by a little. The figures she had heard whispered about her father's ruin for 10 years. She sat on the floor of the linen room a long while, with that page in her lap, before she folded it into her sleeve. And that evening she said nothing to Hannah, until the shop was shut, and the 2 of them sat over the last of the tea. And then she laid the page flat on the table between them, and told her what it was. Hannah looked at it a long time, without touching it, the way a person looks at a thing they have half expected for years and hoped never to see. A thing that is gone asks nothing of you, Nell, she said finally. You mourn it, you set it down, you go on. But a thing that is only buried, that waits, it does not rot quiet the way a dead thing rots. It waits for somebody to come along with a spade. She tapped the burned page once with one blunt finger. This has been waiting 10 years for you to come along, she said, and I think you know it. And Eleanor said she did not know what it proved. 1 page, burned, half a story, and Hannah said that was exactly why she had to find the rest of it, because half a story left buried was worse than no story at all, and asked her, in the plain way she asked everything, who in that house had been there the longest, who might remember where papers went in the old days before Vane's time. And Eleanor thought of old Pruitt, who had been under groom and then dovecote keeper at Rowan Chase for longer than anyone living, who had known her father, who still lived in the low cottage by the west wall and fed the doves every morning of his life. She went to find him the very next day, before her nerve could talk her out of it, and that was the decision, small and quiet, and made over cooling tea, from which everything after it followed. Old Pruitt sat on an upturned crate outside his cottage, with a bowl of grain in his lap and doves crowding his boots, and he looked at Eleanor a long moment before he spoke, the way old men look at the grown children of people they have buried, taking the measure of what the years have done. Wren's girl, he said, not a question, and she said yes, and sat when he waved a hand at the second crate, and told him about the burned page, and watched his face go carefully, deliberately blank in the particular way of a man deciding how much of an old promise he is still bound to keep. He asked to see the page, and studied it a long time, and when he handed it back his hand was not quite steady. Your father came to me the week before they put him out, he said, gave me a thing wrapped in oilcloth, and told me if anyone ever came asking for the true count, I was to give it to them and no one else, and not before. I asked him true count of what, and he said, A ledger does not lie, Pruitt, only the hand that holds the pen. And he would say no more than that, and I never asked again, because a man does not press a friend on the last favour he'll ever ask of him. Eleanor's own hand had gone to the thimble at her wrist without her meaning it to. Where is it? She said, and Pruitt looked at her a long moment more, weighing something, and said the dovecote, in the old stone, 3rd course up from the floor on the north face. Loose behind the mortar since before either of them were born, and that he had checked it was still there not a fortnight past, the way he checked it every year on the day her father died, out of a habit he had never told a living soul about until now. She went to Vane first, before the dovecote, because she wanted to see his face when she named the discrepancy, some hard small part of her wanting to watch him lie before she knew for certain that he was lying. He received her in the estate office with perfect courtesy, offered her tea she did not take, and when she laid the burnt page on his desk and asked him plainly why the figures did not agree with the account given for her father's dismissal, he did not flinch, did not colour, only looked at the page with mild professional interest and said that old papers were often incomplete, that a single torn sheet proved nothing against 10 years of settled record, and that he understood, of course he understood, how a daughter might wish to find her father blameless. It did her credit. It truly did. But that wishing did not alter figures, and figures, Miss Wren, were the only honest thing in this world, arithmetical, which the young always mistook for cruelty. He offered her, gently, as though it cost him something to say it, a position keeping the household linen permanently, a fair wage, security she had not had in 10 years, if she would set the matter down and let old grief lie where it belonged. She thanked him and said she would think on it, and left with her heart going hard and her hands steady, and that steadiness frightened her more than fear would have. She went to the Dovecote the following dusk with Pruitt at her side and a candle stub in her pocket, and the doves wheeled up in a soft grey cloud at their entering, and settled again along the beams, and Pruitt found the loose stone by feel more than sight, his old hands remembering what his eyes no longer trusted, and drew out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff and dark with age. Eleanor unwrapped it with hands that would not quite hold still, and found her father's second ledger, his true accounts, kept alongside the false ones he was made to sign, every rent, every sum, every discrepancy between what tenants paid and what was recorded, and a covering letter in his own upright hand naming the man who had, over 3 years before her father was ever blamed, been quietly altering entries after the ink was dry, entering sums lower than collected, and pocketing the difference, and forging, badly at first and then with practice, her father's own signature over the false figures, once he understood a scapegoat would be wanted and had already been chosen. The name in her father's letter was Josiah Vane. She read it through twice by the candle's poor light, Pruitt silent beside her, and she was still reading it a third time, her whole chest gone tight and strange, with a grief 10 years overdue arriving all at once, when the Dovecote door swung wide, and the Dowager Duchess stood in it with a lantern of her own, and a face carved entirely out of suspicion. "What is this?" she said, her voice cutting clean through the soft complaint of the birds, thieving in the estate's own outbuildings now, is it? And Eleanor rose too fast, the ledger clutched to her chest, like a child snatched from water, and had no answer ready that would not sound, to a woman already certain of her guilt, exactly like a confession. The Dowager did not wait for an answer she had already decided she did not believe. She crossed the Dovecote floor, with a straightness of back that made Eleanor, 29 years old and holding proof of her father's innocence in both hands, feel 19 again and entirely without standing, and she held out one gloved hand for the ledger with an authority that had never once in her life been refused. "Give it here," she said, and Eleanor, astonishing herself, did not. "I will not, your grace," she said, and heard her own voice shake, and could not help it. "But this belongs to my father's name, and I have waited 10 years to hold it, and I will not hand it to the first person who walks in on me holding it, and calls it thieving, before she has asked a single question." The Dowager's eyes went narrow, and Pruitt, God keep him, stepped half in front of Eleanor, without seeming to mean to, an old man's body placed between a young woman and a duchess out of nothing but old loyalty, and said, in a voice gone rough with more feeling than Eleanor had heard from him yet, that he had kept that ledger 10 years on Thomas Wren's own instruction, and would swear to it before any magistrate in the county. And the Dowager's gaze went from him to the oilcloth to Eleanor's white face, and something in her calculating stillness wavered, just slightly, the first crack Eleanor had ever seen in that carved composure. She did not soften. She said only, coldly, that the matter would be looked into properly, that Eleanor was to bring the papers to the house in the morning, and not before, and that in the meantime she would thank her not to go about the estate whispering accusations against a man who had served this family faithfully for a decade. She left the Dovecote with her lantern swinging and her back straighter still, and Eleanor stood shaking in the settling dust of disturbed birds, and understood, with a coldness that went all the way down. That word of this would reach Vane before morning, and that a man who had spent 10 years covering one theft would not hesitate long over covering a second. Word did reach him, and faster than she feared. Within 2 days it was Vane, not the dowager, who came to the mending shop himself, alone in the soft grey hour before the shop opened, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his smile arriving, as it always did, half a second before it reached his eyes, and offered her this time not employment, but money outright. A sum that made Hannah's face go carefully blank behind the counter, in exchange for the ledger and her silence both. Framed as kindness, framed as sparing an old grief further airing, framed, when she refused it flatly, as a warning wrapped so gently in courtesy that it took her a full minute after he had gone to understand she had been threatened at all. A woman in your position, he had said, mild as milk, cannot always choose which stories are believed about her, Miss Wren, and I would be sorry, truly sorry, to see this shop lose its custom over an unpleasantness nobody need have known about. And then he had gone, unhurried, hat back on his head, and Eleanor had stood in her own doorway, with her hands not shaking at all. Gone past shaking into something colder and clearer. That same week, worse in its way because it came from a mouth she had begun, against all her own good sense to trust, the Duke sent for her not to the linen room but to his study, and told her gently that he had heard of the dovecote, of his mother's temper, of Vane's visit to the shop, and that he thought it best. For her own safety and her own peace, if she set the whole matter down now, took a sum from the estate to cover whatever the affair had cost her, and let him handle Vane's dismissal quietly through the proper channels, once the assembly and the wedding were behind them, and the estate's finances were settled enough to survive the scandal of a public reckoning. He meant it kindly. She could see that he meant it kindly, could see the trouble in his face, the ring on his smallest finger turning under his thumb, the way she had noticed it turn before every hard thing he said to her since the linen room. But she heard, under the kindness, the shape of the same offer Vane had made her in different clothes, 10 years of her father's name still unspoken, for the sake of somebody else's convenient timing, and something in her that had bent for 10 years without breaking finally, quietly, would not bend further. I have been asked twice this week to set my father down for money, Your Grace, she said, and I begin to think the whole world would rather pay me than hear me. And she left his study before he could answer, and did not go back to the hall the next day, or the day after, and told Hannah, white-faced over the shop counter, that she believed she had lost the only thing she had gained in 10 years of asking nothing of anybody, and Hannah, for once, did not argue her out of it, only put the kettle on and let her sit. The assembly came on a night that broke the drought at last, a storm crossing the fen in the small hours before it, so that the morning after came up rinsed and clean and cool for the first time in 6 weeks, the wheat lying flattened, but the air, everyone agreed, easier to breathe than it had been all summer. Eleanor had all but decided not to go, had told Hannah as much 3 separate times that week, until Hannah, out of patience at last, set both hands flat on the counter, and told her that a woman who spends 10 years refusing to be seen has no grounds left to complain that nobody sees her, and that whatever else happened tonight, she was not going to sit above a mending shop in the grey while her father's name went another year, unspoken for. So she went, in the grey, because it was the only good dress she owned, and stood at the edge of the great hall's crowd with the ledger and its covering letter, copied twice over in her own hand at Hannah's insistence, in case the first were ever lost or stolen, folded flat inside her bodice against her heart. The hall blazed with candlelight, the whole county assembled, Honoria Cresswell radiant on nobody's arm just yet, the dowager upright in black at the room's head, Vane moving easily through the crowd with a glass in his hand, and his smile working the room the way it worked everything. And the Duke standing near the musician's days in a coat, the colour of the night outside, not dancing. Not yet. His eyes finding the doorway every time it opened until they found her in it and stopped. He crossed the room to her before the first set was called, in front of everyone, in front of his mother and his intended bride and every family in Fembridge who had ever lowered their voice at her name. And he did not offer his arm to Honoria Cresswell as custom, and every eye in the room expected. He stopped in front of Eleanor Wren in her 10 years of grey, and asked her to stand up first. The room went silent the particular way a room goes silent when it understands, before it has quite worked out how, that it is watching something it will describe for years afterward. It is the rank of the house that stands up first, always, at every assembly Fembridge had ever held. The highest lady in the room opening the floor before anyone else may move, and every soul present knew that rank belonged tonight to Honoria Cresswell, or, failing her, to the Dowager herself, and knew equally well that the Duke of Rowan had just set that whole order aside in front of the county, by offering his hand to a mender in a grey dress, with her father's name still unspoken over. Honoria Cresswell, to her lasting credit, did not flinch or colour or reach for offence. She stepped forward instead, into the silence, before Eleanor could find breath enough to answer, and said in a voice pitched to carry the whole length of the hall, that she thought his Grace entirely right, that she had in fact been waiting some weeks for the courage to say as much herself, and that there was a gentleman of her own acquaintance, Dr. Aldous Finch, standing not 10 feet from her at this very moment, whom she had long esteemed rather more than duty had permitted her to say, and that she would be obliged if nobody present thought less of either party for a betrothal ending here, tonight, by mutual and entirely willing consent. A ripple went through the hall that was half laughter, half astonishment, and under cover of it Vane's face, for the first time since Eleanor had known him, showed something naked and unrehearsed, because Honoria's fortune leaving the match meant the estate's debts he understood far better than most in that room, would want examining sooner rather than later, and it was in that unguarded moment, with every eye still turning between the Duke and the woman in grey, that Eleanor drew the ledger from her bodice and held it up, not to the Duke, but to the room entire, and said that she had waited 10 years to be heard, and had decided this was the night she meant to be. She read it aloud herself, standing where she was, her voice shaking at first, and then, as the words found their old rhythm, the rhythm her father had used reading figures to her as a child, going steady and clear, every sum, every altered entry, every place where a signature had been copied close but not close enough, and the covering letter last of all. Her father's own voice come back into that hall after 10 years of silence. A ledger does not lie, only the hand that holds the pen. Vane moved then, a single motion, fast and instinctive, and entirely unlike the careful stillness he had worn for 10 years, lunging half a step forward with his hand already out for the pages, as though he might yet snatch them from the air and undo, by force, what could no longer be undone by anything but force, and the movement itself, more than any word Eleanor had read, was what turned the room fully against him, because a man with nothing to hide does not reach. 2 of the estate's own tenant farmers, men whose rolls he had padded for a decade, put themselves quietly between him and the door before the constable was even sent for, and vain. To his own strange credit, did not struggle against it, only stood very still a moment with his hand still half raised, and something moved through his face that was, for one unguarded instant, almost grief, the look of a man watching the only version of himself he had built in 10 years come apart in public. And then he was gone. Walked out under guard with what was left of his composure gathered carefully back around him, saluting no one, courteous to the last, and the hall exhaled all at once, a great shared breath. And the Dowager Duchess crossed the floor to Eleanor with a face that had gone, for the first time in 10 years, entirely without its armour, and said, before the whole room, that she had doubted this family's account of Thomas Wren more than once across those years, and had lacked the courage or the cause to say so, and that she was, tonight, saying so, and that she was sorry, and asked nothing in return, which was, everyone present understood, the nearest thing to an apology that woman had made to anyone in living memory. The two of them found the terrace after, away from the noise, the storm washed dark smelling of wet stone and cut grass. The doves settled invisible somewhere overhead in the dark bulk of the dovecote across the park. And the Duke stood a long moment turning his father's ring, before he finally said the thing plainly, the way she had wanted him to say it for weeks, without knowing she wanted it. "I sent you away with money because I was afraid," he said, "not for the estate, for you. I thought if I could just keep the worst of this from touching you until the wedding was behind me, and I had some power of my own to use, I could protect you properly, instead of watching you be ruined by my own indecision. It was cowardice dressed as care, and I am sorry for it, and I would like, if you will let me, to spend considerably longer than 10 years making it up to you." She let the silence hold a moment, because she had learned that too, from him as much as from anyone, and then she told him her conditions, because a happy ending taken without conditions was not one she had any use for. She would keep her trade, whatever else came of this. Her needle was her own, and would remain her own. Her father's name would go up on the estate rolls, in the parish record, as steward, honestly, in full, this quarter, and every quarter after, not quietly amended but stated. And she would not be a secret kept for anybody's convenient timing, not his mother's, not the county's, not his. He said yes to all of it before she had finished asking, and there was a silence after that neither of them hurried to fill. And somewhere above them in the dark a single dove shifted on its ledge and settled again, first out in the morning, and first home every evening of its life, the way it always was. A year on, almost to the week, Eleanor Wren stood again before a glass, though not the cracked one over the mending shop, and dressed for a morning that had nothing sorrowful in it at all. The grey dress hung at the back of the wardrobe still, cut down that spring into something small and soft, for Hannah's first grandchild, christened the week before in the same church where the county had once lowered its voice at her name, and now, more often than not, did not. The thimble sat on its ribbon at her wrist, as it always had, worn a little thinner still, and beside it now a plain gold ring that had been Julian's grandmother's, turned once, twice, out of the same old habit, though there was nothing left in her to steady against. Outside the window the doves stirred over the dovecote roof, and the white one broke from the flock, and circled twice, and came home to the ledge, and down in the yard she could hear Hannah's voice, tart and pleased, instructing somebody far too young to be listening properly in the correct way to set a hem, so no one could ever tell where the tear had been. And a man's voice, warmer than it used to be, answering her back. Eleanor came down to meet them both in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, and that is where we will leave them, in a house with its books kept honestly, and its doors standing open, which is very often, in the end, the whole of what any of us were ever really asking for. If this one sat with you a while by the fire tonight, stay a moment longer before you go. I think of Eleanor turning that thimble on its ribbon, and I wonder how many of you are carrying some small worn thing of your own, waiting for somebody to finally ask you to stand up first. And I would love to know in the comments which line found you tonight, and if you'd like more evenings like this one. Settle in, and subscribe to Drek Charlo Hate Channel _name EUs, so the next story finds you when it's ready. I've the kettle on already, another one lit and waiting for next time. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to yourself before you close your eyes.